Here's a question for you. Can you fry an egg on top of Mount Everest? Between the altitude, temperature, and difficulty of transport, there's definitely a lot of factors to consider, but surely by far the biggest one is why you should even bother at all. Wouldn't it be way easier and way better to just cook it in a kitchen like a normal person, right? This is the question asked by Arctic Eggs, a game all about, get this, frying eggs in the cold. It sees you playing as a mystery person in some sort of weird chicken-themed dystopia, tasked with frying eggs, on both sides as always, for a variety of weird characters and using progressively weirder ingredients. You might start off with eggs and bacon, but sooner or later you'll end up cooking full bottles of beer, cigarettes, and even live pufferfish. And the oddness of Arctic Eggs doesn't end there. See, not only are you cooking disgusting meals, you also have to actually maneuver the ingredients around a virtual frying pan using nothing but your mouse, and it is agonizingly difficult. Even doing something like flipping over a single egg once took upwards of an hour for me to get comfortable doing, and so trying to manage 3 eggs, some bullets, and a bunch of ice all at once is incredibly frustrating and hard to manage, to say the least. Long story short, Arctic Eggs doesn't exactly have much in common with the cooking game greats. In fact, it almost seems to go out of its way to break every design tradition that decades worth of games about food have laid down. For example, most games with culinary mechanics simplify and abstract the complex techniques needed to cook things into nice basic mini-games or menus. Arctic Eggs, on the other hand, tries its damnedest to simulate complex physics interactions and doesn't give you anything close to the tools needed to control them. Most cooking games have you making things that look nice because you're supposed to feel proud of what you've made. Arctic Eggs instead emphasizes just how gross the things you're making are and how upsetting the environment you're making them truly is. And where basically all games about cooking are if not relaxing, then are at least positive and fulfilling experiences, Arctic Eggs seems to delight in a perverse sense of unfairness as it throws yet another cockroach on your pan. Great, love it, having loads of fun. But why does the game do this? What's the point of making a game that's, like, the opposite of what people expect out of a cooking game? What's the point of ignoring years of design techniques that are proven to work and make for fun games in favour of a weird, untested interpretation instead? What's the point of trying to fry an egg on top of Mount Everest? In case it wasn't obvious, I actually think Arctic Eggs is great. Not just because within its bleak world and frustrating controls it is a really good game, but also because it got me thinking about stuff that defies traditional design conventions, not by accident, but on purpose. See, now that games have been around for a few decades, certain ideas and techniques have become entrenched in our collective culture, to the point that we often don't even think about these unwritten rules at all. What direction do you run in a platformer? Yes, obviously, you're onto the right. What do you need to include in every RPG party ever? Yes, correct, a tank, a healer, and some DPS. What button makes you jump? Nowadays it's almost always the one at the bottom. The spacebar on a keyboard, B on a Switch controller, A on an Xbox controller, and X on a PlayStation controller. In fact, the whole dual analog stick design of controllers to begin with is itself another design orthodoxy heralding all the way back to the days of the PlayStation 1, and it came about because the original idea was so successful that everyone started copying it, giving us a nice universal standard foundation from which we can now iterate and experiment without having a bunch of competing formats. I'm sure we're all better off not having to use anything like the abomination that was the Power Glove. Ugh. Anyway, these kinds of patterns catching on is a good thing, and without certain ideas and expectations becoming standardized, then many of the genres we love today wouldn't exist. If people had never decided to copy Dune 2's spice fields, then the real-time strategy genre as we know it, which is still based around mineral fields, gatherers, and expansionary base building to this day, would be completely unrecognizable if it even existed at all. However, just as orthodoxies can mean that players know what to expect out of games and can provide developers with easy-to-use templates that allow them to make good games more reliably, so too can they constrain the ways that we think about games. If these unwritten, invisible rules of what makes for quote-unquote good design become too ubiquitous, or go unquestioned for too long, then they can end up so entrenched that they trap games in a prison of obligations and conventions, and perhaps even worse, blinding us to alternative perspectives and ways of doing things as we become literally unable to conceive of ways of making or playing games that aren't built around these imaginary design pillars. A nice easy example of this can be seen in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and the common design technique of slapping a distinctive colour, usually yellow, on important objects to hint diegetically to the player what stuff they can interact with. Normally, this design choice is a great idea, and it goes a long way towards aiding communication in a way that isn't distracting. It was first popularised by stuff like Mirror's Edge, and as games have gotten more visually busy, this colour coding technique has become ever more important. Imagine trying to figure out what boxes you could break in the new Resident Evil 4 remake if they weren't painted yellow for you. Unfortunately, not all games use this technique appropriately. In FF7R2, contextual highlighting is applied seemingly with little regard towards its original purpose of clarity. This wall, that's part of a linear segment where the climbing is basically automatic, is distractingly slathered in yellow paint, even though you literally can't miss it. And this climbable wall in a cave that's tucked away in a corner in the dark is only signposted by some faint yellow moss, which owing to the conditions is still very difficult to spot. With that second example being particularly egregious when the cave in question is covered in big glowy crystals that are way more eye-catching than the thing that's supposed to draw your attention. Essentially, an overfocus on a rigid, narrow idea of good design has actually led to the developers making a marginally worse product, because they've ignored less conventional solutions to the same problem in favour of going with the flow. For example, using architecture to funnel the player's progress, or just using a big crazy taxi arrow, which, to be honest, I would have very much appreciated. This is why games like Arctic Eggs that go against traditional design wisdom are so fun. You won't find any of the shit it pulls in the Good Game Design Handbook, and as a result, rule-breaking renegade games are able to provide us with entirely new and fresh gameplay experiences that lie outside established game design orthodoxy. Not only that, games that break the rules are more than just a novelty. In spite of the fact that they're often a bit janky and unrefined, they can also serve to push the medium as a whole forwards, offering an insight into new ways of thinking about existing genres or giving an outside perspective that challenges our existing assumptions, helping us to imagine new kinds of game and helping to break down some needlessly restrictive design rules. It's this fact that separates a game that breaks or inverts a piece of assumed design wisdom from a game that's just consciously weird or surreal. Many of the strangest games out there are built on the same skeleton of rules and assumptions that underpin their more conventional siblings, and while those games have a critical artistic value of their own in stretching our current artistic understanding to its limits, rule-breaking games take on the in many ways riskier task of imagining entirely new ways to play. So, how do the best rule-breaking games go against the grain to provide an experience that's both unique and useful? Well, from what I've seen, the success of a convention-defying game hinges less on what rules they break, and more on how they break them. It's not enough to simply do something different, like add a new mechanic or alter the setting. These games need to present us with an alternative point of view, something that changes how we think and feel about established concepts, rather than just adding a new coat of paint to a tired old foundation. Take platformers, for example, a genre that's been around for almost as long as video games themselves, that's been defined by a single, almost unquestioned game design pillar for around the same amount of time, and that is the jump. Ever since platformers first emerged on the scene with the aptly named Jump Man, pressing a button to gain a quick bit of vertical movement has been an all but ubiquitous inclusion in every platformer ever, from Mario to Sonic to Crash Bandicoot to Bubsy 3D. However, jumping isn't the bedrock of platformer design like we tend to assume it is, and this focus on just one of many approaches to vertical motion can actually serve to limit a genre that's fundamentally more focused on the fun of movement and navigation in the abstract, rather than one specific mechanic. By ignoring the design traditions set out by the platforming greats, and instead pioneering their own approach to vertical movement, many platformers open up entirely new level design and traversal paradigms while still maintaining a familiar sense of fun. This is why games with a grappling hook are so fun. It's a completely different way to think about movement that's not reliant on staying on the ground, letting us experience the same core enjoyment but with a novel new flavour. Equally, VVVVVV, yeah that's 6, and Downwell use a total lack of jumping to redefine the player's relationship with gravity. Rather than it being the thing you fight against, it becomes a crucial tool you need to manipulate in order to get where you're going. And the likes of Snake Pass or Yellow Taxi Goes Vroom make getting any kind of vertical motion going at all a real challenge, as they open up totally different kinds of level design all about slithering and stretching skywards on scaffold structures and cleverly searching for ramps in the environment to catapult yourself off them in clever ways. All of these games are still about movement, but by freeing themselves from the dogma of the jump, they're free to explore this concept in entirely new ways. Though, I must stress, not all platformers that try are successful in freeing themselves from jumping. Many titles seeking to replace the jump just sort of end up replicating it with extra steps. Splody and Magbot, two platformers that claim to have no jumping, don't end up feeling particularly fresh because their replacements for the jump function in more or less the same way. Splody's explosive potions are basically harder to control jumps, and Magbot's magnets are just jumps you can only use at particular times, meaning you end up thinking about their levels in broadly the same way, despite the fact that they're trying to be different. Compare them to Getting Over It or I Am Bread, two games so divorced from the typical platformer template that it takes a bit of an open mind to realise that they're platformers at all. Shooters are another example of how games that alter our relationship with key mechanics also change how we think about games in the same genre. When Bungie had to design Halo with a controller in mind, they were forced to give up the easy strafing and button real estate that comes with a keyboard and mouse, forcing them to imagine a new kind of FPS because technological limitations had broken the Doom-centric design rules of big arsenals and fast-paced gameplay for them. The result was a game that used Master Chief's limited weapons to create more strategic gameplay that was less about fast-paced action and more about strategizing around an ever-changing toolkit, and shields, originally designed to compensate for slower moving and aiming resulting in unavoidable damage, actually allowed the designers to create more tightly controlled cinematic gameplay that no longer had to be designed around the possibility of different players potentially having different health totals, because shields now gave them a nice predictable baseline. Actually, on that note, technology has always changed our relationship with media and what rules we tend to consider good design. Back before we'd properly figured out 3D rendering, fixed camera angles that borrowed from the language of cinema were all the rage, and this design tradition gave us some great horror games that leaned into the fact that movement was clunky and the developer could control what we saw with extreme precision. But as time went on, and as 3D games became more advanced, allowing players to exercise much more control over their characters and the camera, this style began to fall out of favour, and horror games became much more action-focused as the rules for good design shifted around the available technology. In fact, without consciously retro horror games that reject modern design sensibilities, we may very well have lost slower-paced, more cinematically driven horror games outright. Breaking rules isn't always about discovering new stuff. Sometimes we can reclaim things lost to history by smashing our way through layers of built-up design rules to uncover what things looked like in the past. It's not just mechanical rules that games can break though. Elements of tone, structure, and aesthetic are also just as subject to cultural calcification and can be just as valuable to challenge. Something like, I don't know, Baby Park in Mario Kart is, by the standards of the rest of the game, kind of a terrible track. It's simplistic, there are no shortcuts, heavy cars have even more of a massive advantage, it sucks. But in breaking the format of a standard Mario Kart track by being tiny and basic, this course offers a totally new experience by becoming a chaotic, item-spamming free-for-all using exactly the same mechanics as the rest of the game. Different modes in games are also a good way of demonstrating this. Arcade modes that strip away long-term decision-making, or drafting game types that force players to improvise, are so refreshing because they're inherently familiar, but in existing they break the established play patterns and expectations we've been thinking about the whole time, not only giving us a bit of a break, but also giving us a chance to approach our favourite games from a new angle that we've probably never even considered. I didn't know Prey needed a roguelike mode that really focused on systemic problem solving until I played the Moon Crash DLC, and now I'm firmly of the opinion that it's better than the base game. Basically, just as there are multiple different mechanical ways to evoke the core appeal of a particular genre, so too can the same gameplay fundamentals be turned to entirely different, equally valid purposes. All developers and players need to do is see beyond thematic and structural tradition to realise their potential, and this is just as true for whole genres as it is for individual games. Take the co-op shooter genre for example, your Deep Rock Galactics and your Vermintides. They're typically very empowering and expressive games, and let you have a great time blowing up hordes of zombies with your mates. But a happy-go-lucky approach isn't the only way to realise this particular format. With some balance tweaks to make monsters much more threatening, and some structural changes to emphasise stealth instead of run-and-gun action, a game like GTFO can completely flip the script on a genre that's been stuck in the shadow of Left 4 Dead schlocky fun for more than a decade. Making every enemy essentially a wedge and forcing you to stand still messing around with terminals for ages would make for a pretty crappy Left 4 Dead match, but by reorienting the entire game around this punishing perspective, GTFO becomes a completely different feeling experience using more or less exactly the same mechanical ingredients. The same principle applies to how Stacklands and Witch Hand take the inscrutable mystery of cultist Sims cards and use them to instead create an abstract yet intuitive take on the city builder, or how by removing the controversial element of chances to hit and random damage spreads from strategy RPGs like XCOM or Final Fantasy Tactics, stuff like the Great Into the Breach or Tactical Breach Wizards become a very different feeling, almost puzzle game, focused on meticulous planning rather than risk management, and requiring you to think about some pretty similar abilities in completely different contexts, up to and including their potential for defenestration. Without looking beyond the perspective offered by genre temples, we end up in the situation that open world games were in a few years ago, where Far Cry style towers ended up taking over everything. The problem wasn't the towers themselves, it was in how the success of games like Far Cry 3 tunnel visioned developers and players alike into seeing a broad genre in a very narrow way, namely as a sort of sprawling theme park with lots of mini challenges for you to go and do dotted around the map, but with little in the way of direction or incentive to actually explore. This is a perfect perfectly valid way to design an open world game, but the overprevalence of this one set of rules ended up suffocating other interpretations, either forcing them to conform or alienating players if they tried to break the rules and do something a bit different. As could be seen in the original open world Spider-Man game, a very movement-centric title, having towers out of a sense of open-world obligation when it didn't really need them, as well as the innovative Death Stranding having a pretty mixed reception until audiences were able to work out what it was actually trying to do and how it differed from the then very popular Ubisoft style. Far from just being something that developers need concern themselves with, it's just as important to challenge and break the rules and expectations that exist inside our own heads. If we don't, we'll be stuck not just unable to understand new kinds of games, but unable to succeed at playing them at all. In the cutesy Souls-like Another Crab's Treasure, which by the way is really good, the boss I died to the most wasn't the final boss, or a super hard optional boss, or even the boss you can fight earlier than you're supposed to. I beat him no problem. No, the boss I died to the most was the very first one. Seriously, I just could not beat the very first tutorial boss, and this was because I went into Another Crab's Treasure expecting it to be just another Souls game. I immediately spec'd into high damage, low health, and basically forgot all about the block button, because in most Souls games, blocking is usually straight up worse than not getting hit at all. Unfortunately, that's not how Another Crab's Treasure worked. I died over and over again trying to dodge roll my way through attacks and got very frustrated when it didn't work, all because I was too stubborn to simply adapt my strategy to focus on blocking and defensive play over the hyper-aggressive lens I've been conditioned to view these games through, and it was only by breaking down my mental rules for how Souls-likes ought to be played that I started having fun and could appreciate the game on its own terms. Without challenging these biases and undergoing that sometimes uncomfortable feeling of unlearning what we'd unconsciously assumed were universal rules, we'll never be able to broaden our horizons and see games in a new light. I initially dismissed the game Buckshot Roulette, a game all about playing Russian roulette with a shotgun, as just a dark joke gimmick game, because surely whether you got shot or not was just entirely random, right? Not so. As the game's layers revealed themselves, it became clear that it was really all about controlling information, and you can actually guarantee that you'll never get shot with clever play, giving me a whole new appreciation for high variance games, which I'd always assumed couldn't possibly also be a test of skill. Until now. Equally, it took several attempts over multiple years for me to get the appeal of beloved high-octane shooter, Ultra Kill. The problem was that I kept trying to play it like a Doom-style shooter, which is to say very efficiently and only ever using the best weapons for any given situation, which meant that I had kind of a boring, bad time. It was only after realizing that I should be playing it like a Bayonetta-style spectacle fighter, and that I was supposed to be deliberately taking stupid risks, rushing through levels, and using precisely the wrong weapons for a given situation in order to keep my combo up, that I realized what the game was really all about, and I was able to finally fall in love with it. And by extension, my beautiful husband Gabriel, who's never done anything wrong in his entire life. And that's kind of the thing, right? Doing something different is inherently hard, and in most scenarios you can probably get away with doing the same boring, safe, predictable thing forever and still succeed. But without taking on the burden of imagining new possibilities, and without taking on the risk of fucking up and getting it wrong, you'll never have the chance to do something truly new and special. Which brings me back to Arctic Eggs. Is it a polished game? No. Is it full of bugs of multiple varieties? Yep. Is the difficulty well adjusted? Absolutely not. But the reason why it works is because Arctic Eggs understands the joy of breaking the rules and doing something different just for the hell of it better than anything else. No mechanical potential is left unexplored. The level that reverses your controls might be completely asinine, and the cans of sardines basically come down to physics RNG, but in overcoming these obstacles and learning how to deal with them, you gain a much more complete sense of mastery and fulfillment than if the game had pulled its punches and only used quote-unquote fair mechanics. Each of the disgusting meals you cook are practically the only ways your customers have of breaking out of the bleak drudgery of their lives, and there's a great sense of connection at the end of each level as you and your customer are able to bond over the weird, stupid meal that you've somehow managed to successfully cobble together, that provides the one source of light in an otherwise pretty bleak world. And the recurring motif of the game, the question of can you cook an egg on top of Mount Everest, really puts this idea front and center. It's difficult, pointless, goes against all logic, and yet, you can't help but imagine how you try and solve these problems and what the end result might taste like, even if it ends up tasting bad. Games, and in fact all art that go against convention to do something weird and different, will always be a risk, but hopefully they'll end up being a worthwhile one, both in the sense that these titles can teach us new ways of developing and playing games, but also in a financial one as well. By recognizing games that are doing something new and interesting, even if their implementation might be flawed, and we might not immediately get what they're doing, we can ensure that our favourite genres continue to evolve and avoid the stagnation that plagues a lot of the industry. Look at the new-ish wave of roguelikes, right? A lot of the pioneers that broke away from the very calcified dungeon crawling template the genre existed in for decades, they sort of sucked, didn't they? Rogue Legacy was the game that pioneered meta-progression in roguelikes, and its implementation of these ideas leads to some really boring, unsatisfying gameplay. It's straight up not very good. But without it, games that use the concept well could never have existed, like Hades and Returnal that use power as a narrative pacing mechanism, or any number of games that allow you to unlock more complex characters and abilities between runs. Equally, extraction games, the hot new up-and-coming genre, came about when several developers decided to challenge the Battle Royale design rule that everyone needs to start on an equal playing field and that there are no long-term stakes. Suddenly, we've got a whole new kind of game on our hands, and while the ones we've got right now are lacking in polish and production values, there's also something kind of special about getting to see a genre emerge from nothing in a raw state, before invariably all those fun edges and idiosyncrasies get sanded off over time. Don't get me wrong. Good design practice exists for a reason. We need artistic rules to help us make stuff that we know will work and that people know what to do with. But if we only exist within those guidelines, we end up refining away any interesting texture from our work in pursuit of bland, inoffensive goodness that does nothing wrong, but equally does nothing interesting. And to a certain extent, and with a certain amount of self-awareness, people in my line of work who talk about the correct way to make games and complain about anything that deviates are partially to blame here. Countless video game franchises have ultimately squandered their potential, not because they've gotten worse, but because they've been too afraid to break the rules and push against design convention, surrendering their identity in the name of balance and universal palatability. And it falls to weirdo experimental games to fight this trend, and to us as an audience to celebrate those creatives who are brave enough to design games incorrectly, all in service of seeing what happens when the rules get broken. So, the next time you're playing a game that feels not just fresh and exciting, but like it's broadening your mind, why not stop for a moment and try to figure out what rules it's breaking and what assumptions about the way games work you've been making the whole time without even realizing. Could it be that games need to communicate in a language you already understand? Well, what about Chance of Senna? Could it be that games need to have a standardized control scheme? What about Katamari Damacy? Or could your core assumption even be that games need to be fun at all? All you need to do is look at Destiny 2. Which, really, is to say, even if you don't want to play the sort of weirdo, pretentious nonsense that I like, it's still important to take stock of our mental boundaries and do our best to surpass them. Even if that means, once in a while, just for the hell of it, doing something just a tiny bit different. Hello, and welcome to the After the Video segment. Wow, did you do something new with your hair lately? No? Well, you're looking great. Oh no, sorry. Ugh, not you. Wow, this is awkward. I actually meant the other person watching the video. Sorry. Anyway, this is the place where I like to cool down at the end of every video and talk to you all about some cool things that you ought to be made aware of and that you really should check out. For example, I recently found out all about a very cool YouTube channel called Katie and Catburger, which sounds like a cartoon from the mid-noughties, but is actually an incredibly underrated duo who love talking all about video game stories and the cultural background that informs some of the most recent indie smash hits. Katie serves as the main face of the channel, and Catburger is some sort of weird combination of adorable mascot and philosophical encyclopedia, and it's really refreshing to see two very different voices sort of bounce off each other in the same video in a way that helps give their analysis a lot of bonus depth and multifacetedness. I think Katie and Catburger are just starting to find their rhythm and voice as creators, and as a result they've put out some real bangers lately, like a video all about the backrooms and a really well researched one about Dan Mullins, so please do check them out so you can say you subscribe to them before it was cool. Of course, those aren't the only cool people I need to talk to you about. There's also my wonderful, spectacular, and ever so fantastic patrons. It's these people who have taken on all the slack of you dirty cheapskates that allow this channel to exist and put out cool stuff for free without any adverts or sponsorships. If they weren't here, then the Raid Shadow Legends torturers would have broken my resolve years ago. And in return for giving me the psychological strength needed to resist the dark whispers of NordVPN, I give them some special little treats, such as early access to videos, some extra special behind the scenes goodness, extra analysis content to consume, and if you'd like to join the higher tiers, you can even get your name in the credits, both in written form, in extra special premium golden form, and even specialer spoken form like these fine people, who are Ali Wright, Andrew Labrano, Asaran, Auna94, Bobby, Brennan Spalding, Brian Notariani, Constantine Amend, Cosmix360, Daniel Metjes, Dirk Jan Karambeld, Digleteer, Dis Ellie, Ekton, Edward Franklin Woods, Edwina the Space Bun, Eugene Bulkin, Gazcole, Jacob Dylan Riddle, Jinkaloid, Kevin Help Us, Conlove, Kaingi, sorry I've got no idea how to pronounce the A with an umlaut, Luke Kokoran, Mace Windu 54, Marika Vladilena Altair, Mark Vallant, May Contain Fox-like Substance, Meme Dragon, Mika Oi, Nate Graff, Oliver Marhofer, Patrick Romberg, Peter Tomasic, Reddedex, Regal Regex, Ray's Dad, Silver Volfy, Steam Rollerman, Steve Riley, Ty Guren, Tyler Duncan, Uprising, Von Boomslang, Whimsical Wisp, Zach Brandmeier, and ciao. Okay, that's it, that's all. I'll see you around. Bye!